Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Adamize. I am Adam Serwer of Mother Jones, and I'm here with my friend Jamelle Bouie of the American Prospect. How are you doing, Jamelle?
I'm doing pretty well, Adam. Thank you for having me.
So first things first, who's going to win on Tuesday?
Obviously, Barack Obama's going to win. I don't just say that because I'm unreasonably confident, though that is also the case. I say that just because all of the polling looks to be going in that direction, and has been really for the last few weeks. In at least the swing states that will determine the election, Ohio, Wisconsin, Iowa, Nevada, Colorado, Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, and New Hampshire, Obama has either held a lead in most of them, was tied in the case of Virginia or Colorado, or a slight deficit in North Carolina and Florida. So as long as that holds true, the odds of Obama winning are just really high. I mean, obviously anything can happen, but I would be very surprised if Obama didn't get reelected on Tuesday.
Well, so this is sort of like sparky debate, right? Because for a while, like the national polls are tightening up now, but there was a while in which the polls were sort of pointing towards an electoral college popular vote split, right? There was like a national, Romney was ahead by like a point or two on average in the polls, but Obama's sort of firewall, so to speak, in the swing states of like 2 to 3, if not more, and if not bigger leads in states like Ohio and Iowa, were sort of keeping him the favorite. So this sort of sparked this whole debate about, which polls are correct,
Right.
And whether or not the state polls are, as one of my favorite words this election season, skewed in favor of Democrats. I actually am fairly agnostic on this point. I mean, I think to a certain extent the Republican reaction has been ridiculous, which is just sort of to suggest that there's like a sort of crazy conspiracy to make Obama look like he's winning, most of which has sort of been expressed as ire towards the mathematically inclined Nate Silver.
Right.
But it's not totally far-fetched to me because like likely voter models are a guess as to like what the electorate is going to look like. It's not totally far-fetched for me that the polls might be a couple of points off, which in certain states would be really serious in terms of defining who wins.
Right.
But it's not totally crazy to me that could happen. I mean, I still think there's a really good possibility that Romney could win on Tuesday. But the polls debate has just been interesting, just because it's just another sort of manifestation of Republican distrust of social science.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not even social science, right? It's sort of just, I mean, as far as the skewed thing goes, it's just sort of like math, right? Like, because I don't think anyone, or no responsible analyst of the election is saying, look at these one or two polls, and here's my case. They're saying, look at sort of the collected average of all of these polls. And then, what are the odds that a candidate behind by this much or ahead by that much either gains or loses in, some short window of time. So, which is just to say that the Republican response is like even more ridiculous when you just consider there's nothing complicated going on here. It's really, averages of numbers. I was going to say, I've never actually thought there are many chances of a, popular vote split, of an electoral college popular vote split, just because, for that, so Sean Trend at Real Clear Politics has pointed this out, as is I think Nate Cohn at the New Republic. But the basic point is that for that to happen, Romney would have needed to be ahead by a larger margin than just 1 or 2 points in the polling. 1 or 2 points
in the national polling.
I mean, national polling, right? Like given that like everyone tends to make ground in the end and like reach where they're supposed to be, I guess. Romney would have needed to have like a 3-point lead. Then you can start saying, oh wow, yeah, maybe there'll be a split. But 1 or 2 points is still a bit too narrow to
right. It's a statistical tie, so to speak.
Right. And I mean, now I think whoever wins will win with 50 plus whatever percentage of the popular vote. I don't think there's going to be a split. It might be. I think Nate Kahn pointed this out today. It might take a while for returns to come in for Obama, just because of mail-in voting in states like California and Oregon. So for a little while, it may look like there's a split. But when all the votes are counted, I think you'll see Obama with clearly 50% or more of the popular vote, and then a solid, electoral college victory. Of course, none of this will stop the right from declaring Obama an illegitimate president, which is just what I'm prepping for on November 7th.
You mean if Obama wins, of course he's going to win with less of the vote that he won in 2008,
right?
And he's going to win with fewer electoral votes than he won in 2008, most likely.
It's absolutely.
And so, like, I think that there's, like, a couple of ways in which the most mild of the illegitimacy arguments is going to be he didn't win with as much of a margin, and he's one of the few presidents to do that in a long time.
Right.
But the other one, I think the more sinister one, of course, which I sort of see people prepping for, and which you sort of saw little inklings of back in 2008, which is the dwindling Democratic share of the white vote, which is actually not an Obama phenomenon, which is sort of like, in the way that it expresses itself in a critique of Obama, is qualitatively different than with previous Democratic presidents.
Right, Democrats in the Clinton era were worried about the declining share of the white vote, but it was never that Bill Clinton only won. He won fewer white voters than Obama did. Was never sort of a strike against him or anything. But for Obama,
it was never fit into a narrative of because Clinton wasn't actually our first black president, as that stupid meme that never dies goes. There was never the sort of same thing, sort of argument of legitimacy was in the same way was never there. I think people did argue Clinton was legitimate because he didn't win a majority of the vote.
Right.
But the sort of like majority of the white vote question is, I think, a disturbing looming one that we may have to that we may confront in the event of an Obama victory.
Right, and I don't expect it to just be. It's one of those things that you it's based on a critique that you've actually heard quite a bit since Obama got elected, which is, if you remove black voters from the calculation, if you remove Latinos from the calculation, then Obama really isn't that popular.
Yes, this was a column that Byron York wrote a little bit after 2008, and it was ridiculous.
Right, and you sort of see it whenever, lately there's been a lot of the black people only support Obama because he's black going on, most notably from John Sununu, Romney campaign spokesperson. But
not just black people, but Colin Powell, the most admired, I believe, still the most admired political figure in the country.
Yeah, next to Bill Clinton. It's sort of him and Colin Powell. But it's just that too has elements of, of course you have to discount them.
It's a really ironic argument, right? Because the Republican, I think it 90 is something I can't, I may not be getting this right, but I think I read today that something like 90% of the Republican Party's votes come from white voters.
Right.
So it's really sort of an insane argument to say, black people only vote Republican because Obama's black. Vote Democratic just because Obama's black. Not only because most Democratic presidential candidates get 90% plus of the black vote, but the Republican Party is really monochromatic and growing more so, and it doesn't. Instead of recognizing that as an issue, they sort of the argument is that the Democratic Party is too diverse, which is really bizarre.
Right. No, it's actually something that's really kind of striking that this year, regardless of if Obama wins or loses, he will have won, at least 90% of the African American vote. I think he's basically going to repeat his performance in 2008, so let's say 95% of the African American vote.
I think he's going to improve on the Hispanic vote.
Me too. I think it's not just he'll improve, but Romney will drop. Because I think the drop in Romney's support will be greater than the improvement in Obama's. So I think Latino decisions has Obama polling something pulling something like 72%
Not
of the
just
vote.
Latino, but Pew has that as well. There's a bunch of
Right.
surveys that have shown Latinos basically voting like Jews and black people.
Right,
this
and
election.
more like I think Jews are the better or the closer comparison. Like voting like Jews.
Well, there's that old joke about Jews earning like Episcopalians and voting like Puerto Ricans. So it's it.
No, but I was going to say, but Romney is pulling like 25%. So he's seeing about an 8 or 9 point decline from what John McCain got in 2008, and Obama's just getting like a 4 or 5 point increase. So there's probably Latino Republicans staying home this year. Mm-hmm. rather than vote for Mitt Romney, and then Obama is picking up likely the sort of lean-ish Republican Latinos who have just been turned off by the GOP's intensely nativist rhetoric of the last several years.
If we could go back to like the whole polling question for a minute, because I think it's relevant, particularly with regards to Latino voters, just because of the problems pollsters have accurately polling Latino public opinion. But one of the things that one of the reasons, the sort of understated reasons why I think you've seen a lot of Republican pundits reject the polls, and this doesn't apply to all of them, but a number of them, like say Karl Rove, have financial interests in the outcome of this election.
That's right.
So it's like if you're a pundit, but you're also like helping raise money for super PACs and stuff like that. Like basically, if you say Romney's going to lose, the polls are right. You've basically told all the millionaires that you've been, promising a Romney victory to that they've wasted their money.
Right, and not just like a little bit of money, but like
not just a little bit of money, but I mean these people have money to burn. But right, but so like I think that's part of. That's a part of this question. I mean, like, if you're Carl, I mean, like, I don't know, I don't know how you can sort of trust the analysis of someone who essentially, needs you to believe X. Not that, like, as I said, I think Romney has a perfectly good chance to win on Tuesday, but I don't know how you could trust the electoral political analysis of someone who essentially is, like, has an interest in telling you what you want to hear so you can continue to give them money.
Right. One thing you sort of you kind of raised a little bit is this. So I'm kind of curious about what happens if Romney loses with super PACs, right? Because you will have had a lot of rich people, a lot of millionaires and billionaires, to use Obama's phrasing, who will have donated, 6, 7, 8-figure checks to these super PACs,
right?
And for what? Right, like look what you got. You've given tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars to the campaign, to the super PACs and the Romney campaign, and a lot of that money has gone to the RNC. So you've given money to the senatorial committees, the House committees, like the whole 9 yards. And sort of the most likely outcome for Tuesday is Obama stays in the White House, and Republicans don't capture the House, and in fact, Democrats may end up picking up a couple seats in the House, depending on how it goes in Nevada and Arizona and Montana and Nebraska and North Dakota. It's not really that much of a stretch to imagine that Democrats keep their current majority and get like 3 additional seats. And then in the House, Republicans, they get to keep their majority, but it's mostly the status quo. They lose a couple seats. But in national elections, after 2 years, or let's say a year of rich people shoveling all this money at super PACs, they will have gotten nothing.
Right. Well, see, the problem, that's true, and that's sort of like, that's great, but it's, what Republicans are going to say, if that's the case, is like, this proves we don't need campaign finance reform, and we don't need to do anything about money in elections, because obviously it's impossible to buy elections, and all the liberal worries about money corrupting democracy are total nonsense. You guys just want to restrict political speech. That's going to be immediately the rebuttal. Should Obama win, and he sort of said he campaign finance reform is something he'd want to do, the Republican argument is going to be, well, obviously we don't need it.
Right. I mean, well, but of course the and this is something I think we have both brought up. national elections, because they're so expensive, because the marginal dollar isn't worth that much, it is difficult to like influence a national election with a ton of money. But on the state level, if one of us, if I were a billionaire and I had some cash to burn in my pocket and I wanted to like buy the like Idaho state legislature, who's going to stop me?
Right. Like this kind of money advantage is significant in down ballot races, and less so in a presidential election when there's so much free advertising because of news coverage and stuff like that. So it's not that argument will be true. It's not true. But that'll be what people say, and you'll have a lot of sort of savvy pundits saying like, well, I guess it's true. I mean, look what happened.
It sounds persuasive enough to the surprisingly large number of people who write about politics or talk about politics for a living, but don't actually seem to be able to reason or think about politics in a systematic way. As we've recently seen with the whole Nate Silver debacle.
Oh yeah, this is the Nate Silver thing is very strange. I mean, obviously he doesn't need me to defend him because he's a very successful person, but it's been very strange to watch the sort of trained rage, the conservatives train their rage on Nate Silver over what is essentially him, averaging the state polls, which consistently show a narrow advantage for the president.
Right.
And sorry, go ahead.
It's just bizarre because in so many instances it really honestly seems like they don't, or the angry pundits, Joe Scarborough being the most famous of them, don't seem to understand probability.
Right. Like if you
it's just like I have a hard time responding to it because it's like, what do you say to someone who is like, the polls are nearly even, therefore there's an even chance of either outcome happening, and it's like, well, no, that's not how these things work. And just like, what do you say to that person other than?
Well, I mean, I think that the striking thing is, and Alex Perrine of Salon touched on this in his column today. There's no price for being wrong for pundits in America, and like I think there was a study a few years ago that basically showed that being a pundit and making predictions, it's about it's like a coin flip whether or not they're right or wrong, and so this idea that all the people who were totally fucking wrong about the Iraq War still have jobs. None of these people who wrote that Saddam was developing nukes, that he was tied to Al Qaeda. These people are all still people in good standing. But yet there's this sort of conservative movement to be like, if Obama loses, Nate Silver must resign in disgrace. Which is like really bizarre given pundits' track records for making predictions. I mean, it's one thing to make like sort of a non-political or a non-empirical values-based argument for one idea or one candidate or another, but it really is another to be like, we're going to set up this standard that doesn't exist anywhere else in punditry because we really, really don't like this guy.
So this reminds me that I have a standing offer to every news agency that employs a pundit, which is that you can hire me for half the price, a quarter of the price. I'll be making more money, trust me. You can hire me, and I will do the same punditry, except it will be right because I use numbers and don't rely on goat entrails, until you get more credibility and you get to pocket more of your money.
I think goat entrails might actually improve, some of. I mean, look at Dick Morris, who like actually got the electoral votes wrong for different states when he was predicting a Romney landslide. I mean, like that.
I don't understand why people still pay Dick Morris to do anything. Like, is it like funny? Like, is that why the Hill
I think it's like I think it's like a form of. I mean, someone suggested to me as a form of performance art, which I think might actually be true. I mean, to a certain extent, it's like he's like, I don't know. I can't. Remember. He's like a sort of sideshow. He's like a reoccurring like character on a late night TV show or something.
Right.
He just like sort of comes on to like do his shtick and then goes off. But yeah,
I mean, he's like the hack comic of political punditry.
Well, it's certainly like in a world where Dick Morris has not been drummed out of punditry, it's bizarre to be like, well, if Nate Silver's wrong,
Right.
And I think like the focus on Nate Silver really has little to do with sort of his work, and it has a lot to do with I think his right and what Nate writes is actually not very different. And like he's a very good writer and a synthesizer of political knowledge, but like other political scientists have written similar things to what Nate has written, and they haven't drawn half as much rage. And I think it's like reporters actually listen to Nate, like actual political reporters read Nate's site and they listen to him. So when the Romney camp was sort of trying to argue that they had this thing called momentum, which doesn't really exist in politics, coming out of the third debate, Nate's sort of parsing of the polls really sort of showed that wasn't true. And a lot of other political scientists were saying the same thing, but reporters weren't really listening to them. But I think they were listening to Nate in a way that I think really pissed off conservatives who were like, "You're really ruining our mojo here as far as this narrative we're trying to construct." And I think that was when things sort of like snapped. And like obviously he has like a sort of totemic influence for liberals in the sense that like people read his stuff and they like liberals. I said this on Twitter the other day, but I think like liberals deal with panic like C-3PO and conservatives deal with panic like Grand Moff Tarkin. Like when liberals panic, they panic easily and they panic often, but when conservatives panic, they respond with bluster.
It's the retreat in our moment of victory.
Right, exactly. So for Nate, I think like he pissed off conservatives for a number of different reasons, having nothing to do with the actual quality of his work. But having a lot to do with the sort of political dynamic of a close race, where like election coverage of the race can influence things on the margins, and since things are so close, it might actually affect ultimately how the race turns out.
Right. So I'm curious. I know you've long oscillated between Romney is definitely going to win and Obama maybe might win.
So like I was like very much a sort of Romney's going to win guy for a long time. At this point,
I remember last year around this time last year, we both wrote dueling columns at the Prospect. You wrote why Obama's toast, and I wrote why Obama's going to win.
I said, I guess it's sort of, I guess it's cowardly of me to shrink from this, but I did say that I didn't say he was definitely toast, but I said that there were a lot of economic indicators that said he might be toast, and that if certain things didn't happen over the course of the next year, he definitely would be toast. And so there's something. So my opinions have changed in part over the past year because of the upward revisions. So like we had all these months where there were like terrible jobs numbers, and what you saw was sort of like, and it seemed like the economy was performing way below where it needed to be for Obama to win. But then when we started getting more information, and it was clear that the economy wasn't. I mean, like obviously the economy isn't doing well right now, but it was growing a lot more than people thought it was. And people are getting jobs. They're not great jobs. More people are working. So I think to a certain extent, I mean, I don't know. I'm not like an odds person, so I wouldn't say it's like 50-50. But I certainly think Obama has a much better chance to win today than I did last year.
Right. I mean, the way I tend to think about it is sort of like in a piece by piece kind of way. So my thought is, so the polling averages, the collected meta polling averages, show Obama with 1.5 to 3 point leads in Wisconsin, Iowa, Ohio, and New Hampshire. They show him with larger leads in, I guess, like the more peripheral swing states of Pennsylvania and Nevada, though I'm always reluctant to call Pennsylvania a swing state because it doesn't really ever swing. It just looks like it always might.
Well, it used to be a solid Republican state.
Right. I mean, it pretty much it started voting for Democrats in '88 and hasn't stopped since.
Mostly because of demographic changes.
Yeah. And Virginia and Colorado have been tied I mean, I think Obama may have been inflated in those states prior to the first debate, and then Romney kind of reset everything and kind of brought it down to a tie. And then Romney has a slight edge in Florida and a larger, like kind of an Ohio-esque edge in North Carolina. And so my thinking is, what is the likelihood in a week that a candidate makes up that kind of deficit with few undecided voters left? And it's just not very high, right? Like I think the analogy Nate and others have used is for a baseball game or a football game, basketball game where there's a couple minutes left in the game. This doesn't count for baseball, of course, because but for a basketball or a football game, there's a couple minutes left in the game, and the teams are separated by a small margin. 4 points or a field goal, a couple shots, and at that point it's anyone's game, right? Like it's narrow, it's very narrow. Anyone could win, but when you look at things holistically and ask yourself, well, for teams that have found themselves in this situation, what is the likelihood that they've lost their lead? It's not very likely. Just like that's how it works out. And so for Romney to win, a lot of unlikely things would have to happen. A lot of things are just very unlikely to happen, would have to happen. Obama would have to either, A, there's a systemic polling error and all the polls are wrong, or like they're wrong enough in enough states for, things to look way closer than they actually are. Mm-hmm. Or B, Romney actually does make up ground in Ohio primarily, but also in Wisconsin. And then the polls showing ties in Colorado and Virginia are off, and he's actually leading there. Mm.
That's a lot of moving parts, but...
Right, exactly. It's a lot of moving parts, and I know it's life, and life is filled with surprises, some awesome, some horrible, but I have a hard time seeing all those parts falling into place for Romney. I mean, if that were to happen, then I would have a conspiracy theory, and that is that Mitt Romney is actually the Scarlet Witch.
He affected probability in his favor.
Right.
No more Obama. One of the things I want to talk about. So I have some major fears if Obama wins and if Obama loses. My major fear if Obama loses is that the Republican case against Obama has become so racialized at this point. And this is not everybody. I mean, Mitt Romney has really not run the campaign that I feared he would run in terms of internalizing the sort of really tremendously racist Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck critique of Obama. But that part is still there.
In Obama's America, the black kids beat up the white kids on the bus and they cheer.
That whole narrative of Obama as an avatar of racial vengeance for black people, which is the dumbest fucking thing anybody's ever come up with.
That sounds like an awesome superhero.
I mean, right? I mean, I don't. Yeah, that's a rabbit hole I'm not going to go down on camera. but I guess my concern is there's this whole, but there is this sort of undercurrent, right, where it's Obama's the affirmative action president. He's elected solely because of a giant spasm of white guilt. He's in over his head, and this is if he loses, rather than being, for Obama, Jonathan Chait made this argument that Obama is a great president, and I don't really agree with it. And I think one of the big reasons I don't agree with it is that for Obama to be considered sort of one of the great liberal domestic policy reformers in the vein of Johnson, he has to win a second term in order to make sure that those reforms stay in place. So it's really too early to say that he's great in that sense. And I think similar to Johnson, he has some foreign policy problems, chiefly with targeted killing that I think really sort of mar his presidency. But in general, I think that his Obama getting a second term is the difference between Johnson-like and Black Jimmy Carter, and
right. I completely agree.
And if it's the latter, it feeds into this Republican narrative of the problem is we're just not tough enough on black people and they have it too easy, and we need to stop talking about like structural racism and things that and the lingering effects of segregation and slavery, which lasted for hundreds of in combination lasted for hundreds of years, and just we need to stop worrying about racial equality because the problem is just simply that black people already have it too good. And right. I think like that is like my biggest my biggest fear in terms of like Obama losing is like that this becomes, this is how the latest chapter of Black history in America ends, which is this like really nasty paternalistic view of the first black person elected president.
Right. No,
and then it becomes. Let me add just one more. And then it becomes even more self-serving because if the argument. Because even as they talk about Obama this way, there will be a sort of self-praise, a like pat on the back for like, right. and one of the other reasons, but we know this isn't racist because we elected him in the first place. So again, this is another argument for why racism doesn't exist and doesn't affect anybody unless you're white. In which case, in Obama's America, the white kids get beat up by the black kids.
Right. No, I mean, setting aside sort of like my worries about the Republican domestic agenda. I agree, right? That like, if Obama loses, and I was actually talking about, I've been talking about this with a few folks, and they've been. I've talked about this with some African Americans. I've talked about this with some white folks, and my white friends don't really see where I'm coming from with this one, and I find that a little odd because it seems just intuitive to me that given how we talk about not just blacks but marginalized groups in general. If a woman or if a girl in a math class gets a problem wrong, this is a classic XKCD comic. It isn't. Susie got right. Girls suck at math. Susie didn't get that problem wrong. Girls suck at math.
Right.
It's why whenever you're watching local news and someone robbed someone or killed someone, I'm sure it's a reaction of a lot of African Americans who hope that it wasn't some black guy because we know just from experience that for a lot of people they'll see that and they won't say, oh, that asshole stole from someone, black people, what can you expect?
Right.
And so I don't want that to happen to Obama. I don't want Obama to lose
bigger than I don't want it to happen to Obama. I don't want it to happen to black people. I don't want to see that failure collectivized and thrust onto the black community as like a broader judgment of, as I said earlier.
Right, because what will happen is that there are plenty of people out there, plenty of African Americans out there who are presidential contenders, or who could be one day. And if Obama loses, that failure kind of just gets generalized across the black community, they're done.
Right. Like, I mean, what you're saying is you're afraid that progressives and Democrats will be less willing to invest in strong minority candidates if the best one they've ever had fails.
Right, that, and just like, I don't think progressives and white progressives and white Democrats are immune to this sort of thinking.
Right.
This sort of paternalistic, we gave them a shot, and they couldn't cut it, and so let's stick with, someone more familiar.
Someone more safe.
Right, someone more safe. So from that, you'll get that from that side. From a good chunk of Republicans, you'll just get outright shouldn't trust the black guy. And I think you'll see like someone like Deval Patrick. I don't know what his plans are, but like definitely is might be a presidential caliber. No one's gonna try that again.
Well, Wanda Sykes actually joked about this at the first White House Correspondents' Dinner. She was like, "Okay, yeah, he's the first black president, but if he loses in 2012, we're gonna be like, who's that half white guy?" And,
right.
And that's like the joke, right? Like that joke comes from a sense of anxiety at the idea that if Obama loses, it's not just going to reflect on Obama or on the Democratic Party, but on black people writ large. And I think that's frankly a well-founded fear given the history of this country.
Right, because that's happened with all black politicians. I mean, Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson are still cited for some reason as the evidence of some deep pathology among black leaders. Just you can't
pro school choice Al Sharpton.
Right, right.
Who's to the right of most Democrats on education reform today.
Right. You simply can't. You can't be a black I mean, it's still the case that you can't be a black politician and just be allowed to be mediocre, and have it only reflect on yourself.
Right.
Like we'll have equality when like blacks can like, have a George W. Bush or a Rick Scott, someone just really terrible at their jobs, and we'll be like, yeah, John Washington was really awful, but whatever.
On the other hand, I do have some concerns if Obama is reelected. I suppose the biggest one is I think that there's a substantial risk of, as a way of avoiding sequester, of like substantial alterations to Medicare and Social Security as part of like a quote unquote grand bargain with the Republicans. And I think like people should be more, like Democrats and liberals especially, should be more aware of the risk of this possibility, because I think it's a bit like immigration reform. Like I'd like Obama to do immigration reform, but I have this feeling that like it would take a Republican president and like a Democratic Congress to do immigration reform, like in that sort of Nixon to China way. Well, and obviously that didn't require Congress, but you know what I'm saying in terms of like someone crossing the aisle to make a move in the other direction. And I think something similar may be true of cutting entitlements, that Republicans have a better chance of getting it done if they can do it with a Democrat in the White House.
Right. So I'm sort of divided on this, because on one hand there's the example of 2011 where Obama spent a great deal of political capital trying to get some sort of bargain cut, and in the process, almost, I mean, really, I think sort of far more so than the debate, really risked his re-election prospects by essentially the public saw him as being strung along by the House Republicans, and kind of there is a sense that there wasn't really any leadership going on in Congress. And for as much as I'm critical of the House Republicans, I do think that this search for a grand bargain, which again Obama gets no credit for. It's like not just that a bargain didn't happen, and if it did, it would have been really awful. I think for liberal priorities, Obama was offering Medicare cuts. I think Social Security was like more or less off the table, but definitely Medicare was there in response for really not that much revenue, like $800 billion over 10 years, whatever. But even still, this deal didn't happen, but Obama gets absolutely no credit for trying to do it. In fact, every single endorsement of Romney I've read from establishment pundits like knock Obama for not getting a grand bargain done, as if he did not expend, as if his approval rating did not dip to 40% by the middle of 2011 because he was so busy trying to play nice with House Republicans. So there's the example of 2011 that's definitely, progressives be worried about what happens in the event when Obama tries to avoid the fiscal cliff. The other, I think the case against that is again 2011, that I think the Obama administration has actually internalized the lessons of that entire debacle, which was that Republicans don't want to work with you and are trying to break you. And while I know Obama has said that him getting reelected may, quote, break the fever.
I mean, he's promised not to let sequester happen, so...
Right, he's promised not to let sequester happen. He's promised to break the fever. I don't know. I have a hard time believing that he'll go back to that well when it's proven to be so unsuccessful. If he gets reelected, I kind of I don't know.
I think he actually really believes in it. I mean, I disagree with you here. I think he actually really believes in the idea and like wants to get it done. And I would be surprised. I think it'll be. I think it's going to have to be something along the lines of like opposition to privatizing Social Security if it's going to be stopped.
Right. Well, I mean, sort of the good news for progressives, right, is that the next Senate is going to be more liberal regardless.
Right.
That because of Tammy Baldwin's likely to win in Wisconsin, Elizabeth Warren is likely to win in Massachusetts. There are a few others that I can't remember off the top of my head. Chris Murphy in Connecticut. That like a bunch of outgoing senators are being replaced by more liberal members, and a bunch of Republicans, or a couple of Republicans, are being replaced by moderate Democrats. But even then, if the situation is such that the moderate Democrats or the blue dogs really want, to slice a little off of Medicare, but the liberals don't, and there's simply a bit more of them, they have the leverage. So I mean, I don't know. Like, I think.
Sorry.
I mean, like, I'll be honest. I just don't know what's gonna happen. My intuition is that yes, Obama will try to go for some sort of bargain. No, I don't think it's going to include cuts to Social Security. I think that I just don't think. I think that's just political suicide for both parties, right? Like, Republicans don't want to be able to.
That's why it has to be a double suicide. It has to be like Romeo
a murder suicide.
They have to do it together, holding hands. Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes. So
that was Claire Danes? That was Claire Danes, wasn't it?
Yes. Very different Claire Danes. It's weird.
Right, yeah. It's weird.
So if we could, I want to, because we're going to have to close it up soon, but I wanted to get to something you said earlier, which is my favorite endorsement of Romney is the Romney's lying endorsement.
Oh, yes.
It's like, Romney's really a moderate, and he's just lying about being a conservative, so everything's cool, vote for him. I just find the most amazing logic in voting for a presidential candidate, even though, to a certain extent, like, obviously, all polls lie, but, like, in terms of Romney, it's just like, we're really talking about him governing as a completely different person than he's run as. Right. Not like on a particular, like, there have been a couple of issues, like Obama on civil liberties, and like he promised to renegotiate NAFTA, which was obvious bullshit. But like Mitt Romney's entire persona right now, they're saying he will shed and reject as soon as he takes office, which I don't buy for a second.
Right. 'Cause, I mean, I was going to say, it's not so much that, like, they're saying he's going to moderate. They're saying that literally, the moment Mitt Romney gets reelected, he will metamorphosize into a completely different person than the one he's been running for president for the last 18 months, and really for the last 5 years. It's like, it's utterly delusional.
The reason...
And it's like, it's sort of... And it's this weird thing that is hard for me to get, where Republican presidential candidates get I think they all get this. They all get his party's a bunch of crazies, but he's probably not that bad.
The reason why I don't pass. You're getting to, like, the reason why I don't believe that Romney isn't going to be like that. Question is because if Romney was really the person that David Brooks or David Frum thought he was, then like, there wouldn't be, the Republican Party wouldn't exist now. Like, the reason Romney is the way he is because of the way the Republican Party is. That's where the votes are.
Right.
And he has an entire party. I mean, like, he's not going to govern for David Brooks and David Frum because they don't have, how many brigades have they? Very few. Very few. Right. So, like, why would he ever, like, cater to this particular, like, right of center constituency when there are no votes there? Because if there were votes there, that's who he would be.
Right. And I mean, Ezra Klein pointed this out in a really good column today, but when you look at, so Romney, is not clear that Romney has any particular ideology. I mean, he's obviously like a conservative guy. He's a rich white dude in his 60s, so conservative. But his sort of core belief seems to be that he is an excellent manager of things. Mm-hmm. Give him something to manage, and he will manage it like gangbusters. And so, in this case, as a President Romney, with no real core ideology, no real particular policy preferences other than what might be available, when faced with a conservative House, at least, that's deeply invested in very particular transformation of the American government, a vice president who comes from that group of House Republicans, and policy advisors from the previous Republican administration, many of whom believe that, it wasn't that their plans failed, they just didn't try them hard enough. They had to clap louder, and they would have happened. In what world does this President Romney stand up to them and say, no, I am not going to cut taxes by 20% and stick it to poor people?
Mm-hmm.
Like what? I don't like what is the mechanism by which that happens? And it's almost like it reminds me
It's
very
sort of
much
like it's like Paul Ryan plus question mark equals moderate Mitt Romney.
right.
Like that's
Yeah, it reminds me very much of 2008 Obama supporters who voted for the guy they thought existed, not the guy who presented himself to them.
right.
And then were disappointed when the guy
Because relatively hawkish on foreign policy,
right,
like a fairly like regular left of center person. And I think the difference is though that I think that people to a certain extent projected, particularly on foreign policy and national security, and to some extent he misled them. But I think it was also that this perception of Obama, who was much more liberal as a state senator and like clearly tactically decided to oppose same-sex marriage as a candidate in 2008. That he was sort of lying about how liberal he was. I think like there was actually a conservative liberal consensus on this, that he was lying about how liberal he was and it would manifest when he was in office. But again, and this is the reason why moderate Mitt is a myth, is that in office, Obama had to govern in a way that like would allow him to get actual votes. So he was restricted by like those structural like political needs. And for the same reason that Obama didn't go like super, campus liberal, like even if he wanted to, Mitt Romney won't be able to be like Mr. Moderate when in office because he's still going to depend on his base in the same way that a Democratic candidate has to depend on the center.
Right, and what's crazy about this is that the moderate Mitt narrative all sort of ignores everything but domestic policy. But when it comes to things like I don't think there were any. There's no one on the Supreme Court shortlist for the Republican Party that isn't committed to overturning Roe v. Wade.
Right.
And so I think the moderate Mitt narrative has to like really reckon with the fact that on those things, on federal appointments, on judicial appointments, on cabinet positions,
something Obama's really been bad at.
Right. Something that's been a colossal failure of the Obama administration. Mitt Romney will appoint people who see the Commerce Clause as too broad and reproductive rights as too liberal, and that neither of those things are moderate in the least. And I think presidents ought to be held responsible for the appointments they make. And so, if you grant that, then in what world is moderate made even moderate? In this, I mean, the differences between the two candidates in foreign policy are much narrower than I think they look, and you know much more about this than I do. But it does seem to me that a guy who takes advice from John Bolton and Dan Senor, is someone who is probably a little more likely to blow things up as the first resort.
On the other hand, you could make the argument that he would be more politically vulnerable for blowing things up than Obama would be. I mean, if you look at Jack Goldsmith, who is who was in the Office of Legal Counsel in the Bush administration, has made this argument that Obama's tremendous success in extending Bush policies in the war on terror is precisely because he's put a smiley face on them and he's gotten Democrats to go along through like simple partisan identification. And I think you could sort of make the Slate pitch that it would be much riskier for Mitt to start a war after 8 years of Bush and Iraq than it would be for Obama.
My counter to that Slate pitch has always been, looking at the previous 16 years of Democratic and Republican presidencies, only one of them got us tried to occupy a country.
Right.
I mean, I have no great affection for Obama's foreign policy and national security decisions, but I do think that the idea that, it's been bad, but maybe liberals and Democrats will become more angry about Romney so he won't do stuff, just seems ludicrous to me. Because ultimately, people were angry at Bush, but he still invaded Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
He still had the surge.
Well, we'll see either way.
Oh, yeah.
We'll see either way come Tuesday.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Jamelle. It's been a pleasure to have you, and I hope everybody enjoyed the latest episode of Adamize. And I guess take care, man. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me.
All right.
Yeah.